So this session is titled Vulture Conservation in Zimbabwe, and it is presented by John Maxwell, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine and PhD student in the Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at CSU. Before we begin, I do have a small request for you. We'd be really grateful if you could fill out our survey for the symposium, give us a little bit of feedback. For those of you who are in the room, you can use the QR code here to fill that out. For those of you who are online, you will receive a link at the end of the session on your screen. And you should also receive an email at the end with a link to the survey as well. I also wanted to mention there should be time for some Q&A at the end. So of course, those of you in the room, just feel free to raise your hand. But those of you online, there is a Q&A function in the online. So just feel free to put your questions in there. With that, I will turn it over to our presenter. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm John. Thank you all for showing up and showing interest in my project. Those here present and also online who are looking. So I'm here to talk about my PhD project, which has really 4 different topics in it, but they're all focused on the white-backed vulture in Zimbabwe. Before I get into the talk, I'd like to give a shout out to my partners in country as well as my sponsors. So I'm funded through Colorado State Fish and Wildlife Conservation Biology in the Warner College of Natural Resources, and they've provided my PhD funding. And I'm also grateful to the Morris Animal Foundation, who has sponsored, they have funded a large portion of my research funds. In country, I work closely with Victoria Falls Wildlife Trust, which is in the town that I work in for my field work. They host me, they provide me with assistance and vehicles, and really without them, this project wouldn't be possible. And same goes for Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Management. Without their permissions and their assistance in the field, I wouldn't be able to do this work either. At the end of the day, the goal is to do this for their benefit. All right, so to start, I'll just give a little background on vulture biology. So vultures are from the raptor family. Generally speaking, they're all obligate scavengers, meaning that they only feed from dead animals. And they're long-lived. They can live upwards of 40 years. They're slow breeding, so they don't start breeding until they're about 4 to 5 years of age. And they're slow reproducing as well. They only have 1 offspring every year for 4 out of 5 years. Lastly, generally thought to be monogamous. So difficult to confirm if everyone is, but yeah, those all go into play as to what I'll talk about in the future. And there's a number of different vulture species. And their social behaviors, especially their feeding behaviors, vary quite a bit. Vultures are one of the most threatened avian gills globally, and almost all species in Asia and Africa are at least considered threatened. Most are considered critically endangered or endangered. In Southern Africa, of which Zimbabwe is home to, they've experienced even steeper decline. The 8 vulture species of Southern Africa have experienced a greater than 62% decline over the past 30 years. And all species located in Zimbabwe are considered either endangered or critically endangered by the IUCN. My species of focus, according to Ogata et al., who's done some estimates in Kenya, has shown an 83% decline over 3 generations. So pretty serious, and serious for multiple reasons, not only for their own existence, but for the existence of a healthy ecosystem. So some key terms that encompass the elements that vultures provide to their ecosystems. They're considered keystone species, which is a term for species that are disproportionately important for the function of a healthy ecosystem. They're an indicator species, so decline in vultures can also signify declines in biodiversity abroad the landscape. And Lastly, they have really important implications for One Health. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with this term, but One Health basically is the concept that health works at the intersection of human health, animal health, and environmental health. And we'll go into some examples of why vultures are so critical in this position. So India is probably the absolute best example of how declines in vultures can affect One Health. Within 15 years, the vultures of India, Pakistan, elsewhere experienced a decline of 99%. And there was a lot of work. At first, this, people don't really notice this right away, but anecdotal evidence started to come in that they're just seeing less and less, and then eventually the larger conservation community started to really investigate what was underlying this problem. And eventually they did find that it was because of an NSAID drug called diclofenac. It's in the same family as ibuprofen, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. And this causes acute renal failure in vultures. And the Indian subcontinent is fairly unique in the sense that Hinduism, which is a predominant religion, holds cattle as sacred. So cattle aren't prohibited from being consumed. This means that cattle are kept in fairly high welfare, meaning that they'll live to old age. When cattle live to old age, they'll get lame, they'll have inflammation, arthritis, so people try and treat them, and they'll give them this drug. So when cattle die in the field, they, one dead cow that had diclofenac in its system could kill upwards of 50 to 100 birds. And when they're so slow breeding, that can really decimate a population as we see. So what happens when vulture populations decline is other not obligate scavengers, the opportunistic scavengers, start to take over their niche as scavenging. So the populations of feral dogs and rats took over the niche. And as we can see in this small graph, the cases of water pollution and infectious diseases went up tenfold. Specifically, diseases like rabies and cholera, with others that are implicated but not well described. And after the decline of vultures in those 15 years, India now holds over 30% of global rabies deaths every year. And the cost of this decline in vultures has also been estimated, 70 billion per year for the 100,000 deaths, equaling a 4% increase in total healthcare costs. And there are other countries that have tried to study this relationship with declines of vultures. It's certainly not as thorough as in India, which is the best example, but Ethiopia is one that has this study as well. Thankfully, diclofenac has been banned in this country, but their populations have not really improved since, as they're so slow breeding. So to jump into my project, I'm just focused on the whiteback vulture, Gyps africanus. They're native to the open grasslands, savannas, and woodland savannas of southern Africa, pretty much everything south of the Saharan desert, and excluding the Congo. They need open landscapes where they can survey to find food. So the Congo, being the tropics, not exactly ideal for that. As I mentioned before, they reach sexual maturity at about 4 to 5 years of age, and they have one offspring every 3 to 4 out of 5 years. They start to breed around April. Their chicks hatch sometime around June and July generally, and they fledge, which means they leave the nest around October, November. This also coincides with the dry season. So during the rainy season, they're kind of doing their thing. Their foraging range expands as they're not caretaking. And then during this dry season, there's more plentiful food resources, so they stay closer to home. And what's fairly unique about the whiteback vulture is they use a huge network of conspecifics and other bird species to identify carcasses on the landscape. And they feed in huge groups. At some of the carcasses where I worked, you could see upwards of 100 to 200 white-backed vultures. And then you'd see a couple of the other species, but they're usually the predominant vulture on the landscape. Since I have a good audience, thanks again. Can anyone try and list some of the main threats? I have 4 that I've selected. And if not, I'll just give it away, but yeah.
I guess that vultures would be like a signal species for poaching.
Yeah, so broader category, poisoning is the most wide known threat, and definitely the most severe. Any other guesses? Feel free, it's okay to be wrong.
Maybe lack of food as things like climate change and stuff change, like feeding patterns and what animals are there.
Yeah, that's one as well. So habitat degradation, food depletion is considered, vultures are sort of in a unique position where climate change might, who knows, be better for them as more things die, which is a weird way to think about it. But yeah, habitat loss, loss of nesting trees, and food sources as domestic animals sort of take over a lot of the biomass across the landscape. Yeah, those are some of the main ones. And then in more developed parts of Southern Africa, such as South Africa, there is quite a high prevalence of collisions with mostly electrical infrastructure. So that's fairly unique to more developed parts of Southern Africa. I did volunteer at a rehab facility for vultures in South Africa, and I would say 90% of the birds that we took had collisions with infrastructure with broken limbs, most of which can never be released back. But for Zimbabwe, certainly those main 2 at the top are probably the most significant. Zimbabwe in general is less developed than South Africa. So now I'm going to get into the different categories of poisoning. Generally speaking, we have poisoning from poaching, and we have poisoning from human-wildlife conflict. They're similar in some ways. So for poaching, they can be inadvertent victims of poisoning from trophy hunting, where poachers will poison a watering hole with cyanide, or they'll bait something that they want to poach. As I mentioned before, one poisoning event can kill. There was one instance of a poisoning case in Botswana, which is neighboring, that had 760 vultures that were killed from one carcass, which that can set back a population for almost a century. So poaching from trophy hunting is important, and as our guest pointed out earlier, some poachers have even begun to recognize that vultures circling across above a carcass that they've poached signals to anti-poaching response. So they'll use quick-acting poisons to kill those birds as well. And there is a rise in certain parts of Southern Africa of the leaf-based use. It's called muti, or muti, which is mostly from the belief of traditional medicine where vultures signify a future sight in clairvoyance. So holding onto or sometimes consuming or inhaling parts of the vulture can give you properties where you can improve your odds for gambling or taking a test or pretty much any sort of future sight oriented thing. So those are the main forms of poisoning for poaching. On the other side, we have human-wildlife conflict, which is one of the biggest issues in the area that I work. But broadly, livestock herders will poison a carcass because they've been dealing with problems where lions or even hyenas will kill their cattle, and they're trying to reduce the incidence of their food source, their protein, taken by wildlife. So they'll try and kill the predators that are killing their livestock in the same way, inadvertently, they'll poison hundreds of birds. Some of the main poisons that are used are pesticides for agricultural use, as well as cyanide, which is used to extract gold. And we'll get into some of these other potential toxins further on. So a little more about my study site. In the greater landscape, it's part of the Kavango-Zambezi Trans-Frontier Conservation Area, which includes 5 countries. It's the largest land-based trans-boundary conservation area in the world, has the largest population of elephants, and it's the home to a number of species that are endangered or threatened. In particular, my study sites include Zambezi National Park, which is in blue, the Tetsu Safari Area, which is the orange color, and Wangi National Park, as you can see there. Also not listed on that map, but close by is Victoria Falls and Kazuma Pan National Park. So the habitat and the climate in the area, it's generally savanna ecosystems and floodplains. The whole area is protecting the Zambezi and Okavango rivers. And generally speaking, the soil type is Kalahari sands, which flow in from the desert. Zambezi Valley, which is closer to the river, is known for flatter terrains, whereas when you get into Wangi National Park, there are more basaltic mountainous landscapes. Common habitat types, we have dry deciduous forest, scrub forest, wooded grassland, bushlands, and flooded grasslands. And as I mentioned before, the dry season is from May to November. So that's also coincides with when vultures will typically breed. So my 4 main chapters for my PhD are on the following topics. The goal is to assess the population health in the area, establish baseline lead levels, analyze the dietary composition, and survey for avian influenza. For the first part of my project that I'll mention, as I showed in the study sites, we're in an area with quite a bit of protected lands that are managed for conservation. So while there are declines throughout Africa, globally, and even locally, it's not totally known how the populations are doing in our field of study, which is protected. So it's important to better understand what the impacts of their current management decisions are, and to see if there's anything we need to do.
There's a raised hand for a question. Do you want to talk
Yeah,
about
sure.
that now? Okay, we can do that.
That's the dean of the work college.
All right, let me. Oh, I have to turn the volume up real quick. All right, you can go ahead and speak. Maybe that's not.
Okay, I guess I was muted. Good morning, everybody.
Maybe there aren't any hands up anymore.
Can
Sorry
you
about
hear me okay?
You've been an accident.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
So in order to get estimates for population health, mainly focusing on 2 different aspects. One is doing nest surveys to assess the breeding success and reproductive growth of the population. And from that, we can create models to estimate the overall health of the population. And secondly, we can also measure survival using the GPS devices that we have deployed on these birds. So these are just 3 examples of the many drone surveillance shots that we have, which I don't know if you can see, but 2 of them have birds in them. One has a fledgling, and this one has 2 eggs, which is actually pretty uncommon. I just wanted to give some examples. So this is what some of the birds look like. When they're captured, they sort of become defeated. And then some of them look like this, and they're a little more aggressive and harder to tame. This was the biggest one we caught. Pretty sure it was a female, and she was definitely the queen of the carcass. So for this part of my project, we have some success, and we deployed 10 devices, 8 of which are still working. And using these, we can monitor data. We can also send people into the field with any of these stopped suspiciously. Secondly, we identified 156 vulture nests. As you can see in the map, mostly focused on the northern section, and there's a huge density on the border with Botswana in the northwest corner, and that's in what's called Lusoma Valley, which is definitely one of the big strongholds of white-backed vultures in the area. So that going forward will be one of the main focuses for our nest survey because they're so concentrated. So these are what our GPS devices look like. They're solar powered, battery operated, and they send us data every 30 minutes. This is just a graph of the variety of movements that our birds can have. One of our birds, can spend a full day and go from northwest Zimbabwe all the way down to South Africa and back in 2-3 days. So they cover a huge landscape, and that's why it's really useful information to understand what parts of the landscape they use, how much of it is protected areas, and that really can benefit wildlife managers. And lastly, one of our biggest successes this year was receiving the proper permits. Africa can be incredibly bureaucratic, but we have a really great partnership with Zimbabwe Parks and Wildlife Research Council of Zimbabwe. Going forward, we're very, very much excited to continue doing the drone surveys. This slide had some examples of the unfortunately.
We can try the Teams version. That was something that I was gonna try, just to see it. Is that okay if we try that now?
Yeah, you can try it.
Okay.
If it doesn't work.
I think we have a question here.
Oh, yeah.
I just had a quick question about those pictures where their hands were covered in blood. Was that from the vulture fighting them, or is that just blood on the vulture?
Blood from the vulture. That one, it's weird sometimes talking about vultures because it's a pretty morbid discussion, but it was on an elephant calf that was aborted. And it was eating the liver. So.
I think it looks like that is gonna work. So.
I have another question here too.
Yeah.
This is more just like what I'm curious about. I remember you were talking about there's some superstition around like vultures being clairvoyant and bringing like better luck and everything.
Mm-hmm.
Is there also stigma around like them being creatures of death or something? Because that's some of the most common that I've heard, and could that be like a reason why they're poached as well?
Yeah, so I didn't describe it fully, but that's exactly right. So in some cultures, they have a very spiritual relationship. Other cultures think they're dirty, but it's because they can, sometimes they've been seen hovering over animals that are close to death. So because of that association with death, people think they can see the future. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
I'm actually not sure if this is working correctly or not, but it's allowing me to press the play button.
Great.
Is that doing what it's supposed to? No,
Okay, thank you for trying.
no problem. Sorry about that.
Right, so now I'm gonna jump into the second topic for my PhD, which is lead toxicity. Lead toxicity is a threat to birds globally. It's been very well described in the United States. The effects on other landscapes, especially those with less research funding, is not well known. So more generally, lead toxicosis can affect animals acutely, leading to death. And the chronic accumulation of small fragments of lead can pretty much decimate every part of your body. I can't think of any body systems where lead doesn't have some effect. It includes incoordination, weakness, lethargy, hemostasis, liver function, GI function, immune response, reproduction, pretty much everything you can think of. And it's stored long-term in the kidney, livers, and bone. And the bones can become weaker as lead can replace calcium in the structure of the bone. In the US, it's been known that condor exposure is directly related to hunting ammunition. Condors experienced a dramatic decline in the 1900s and 2000s, and this was mostly described from offal or gut piles that have been left in the field by hunters mostly. So when people use lead shot at fragments, and when animals consume enough, over time it will affect them. So you can also further identify the source of lead through isotope concentrations. So in simple terms, there's different ratios of isotopes in ammunition versus in soil, generally speaking. So that's some ways that people have confirmed or validated the theory that it's from human ammunition. And this has a big translation to Southern Africa. Trophy hunting is a huge part of the economy in protecting the landscape of Southern Africa. Some areas are more focused on ecotourism in regards to wildlife tourism, phototourism, etc. And other parts of the landscape are protected by providing quotas for trophy hunting. So about half of the areas that I work in do have some form of hunting. And there are a lot of questions as far as what the actual effects on the birds is. So furthermore, there's a lack of research on this topic, generally speaking, but especially in Southern Africa. So that brings me to a research question, which is basically establishing what the exposure prevalence is in these birds. So to do that, we're trying to use the least invasive methods as possible. Gold standard for validating these tests would be taking liver samples or bone samples. As I mentioned, those are where the lead concentrates the most, but those are extremely invasive procedures. And with a critically endangered species, that's something that we're not comfortable with doing. So our next best method, which is more passive, is collecting blood samples and feathers. So we can collect feathers that we just find when we're doing field work. We find these at nest sites, roost sites, and feeding sites, and we collect the blood while doing capture events. And we can also, using that movement data and the nest sites, etc., we can try to analyze these variables and correlate them, correlate these lead levels to what parts of the landscape are using for lead. So for this first field season of 2024, this is just some preliminary results that need to be validated, but we did find some prevalence of lead on 9 of the 10 birds we sampled. Granted, these were all subclinical, and also the tests we use in the field isn't the gold standard for confirming these. So we're hoping to do some more laboratory work going forward. And this was just an example. While I was at the rehab facility in South Africa, oftentimes these vulture feeding sites will provide euthanized animals. And this animal was shot. There was a horse that broke its leg, so it was euthanized. And they were feeding it, and I told them we should make sure that the bullet wasn't outside of the brain case. And we took a radiograph and we showed that there was a risk of one of the birds consuming this. So just another example of how lead can conspicuously affect these birds. Yeah.
Of the 9 sampled birds, were there some that had more concentration of lead in their blood than others?
Yeah, so of the 9 that we had sampled, generally speaking, the range was 3 micrograms or milligrams per deciliter to 7.5, I believe, which according to the clinical guidelines is subclinical, but it still shows evidence of exposure. And there still does need to be further validation as far as if there are subclinical effects.
So it's not any immediate risk of death with that concentration, but there's.
Yeah, so subclinical means they're exposed, but it's not at the threshold that causes clinical symptoms that I mentioned in the previous slide.
Okay.
And this other illustration is an example of shocking hyoid fragments in tissue. All right, now I'll move on to my 3rd chapter, which is diet. So we can collect fecal matter at nests and roost sites, as well as samples from the birds captured. And using a technique called metabarcoding, we can analyze the species that they've consumed and quantify the ratios. The goal of this is, as I mentioned before in the slide about poisoning, to better identify the threats from poaching, poisoning versus poisoning related to human-wildlife conflict. So that's the real focus of this chapter. Those pesticides that I mentioned are not, they don't stay in the system of the birds, so it's not something you can really measure directly. So this is a more tangible way to sort of hypothesize what the associated threats are from those 2 general topics of human-wildlife conflict versus poaching. So this is the summarized version of DNA metabarcoding. You collect samples, you perform DNA extraction, you metabarcode those, and then you put it through a sequencer which interprets the output of the metabarcodes. And then you can analyze that to get a ratio, not only of the variety of species, but also quantify the proportionality of those. So if you have more, for example, buffalo DNA or elephant DNA versus livestock DNA. And lastly, I'll talk about the final project. Avian influenza, I'm sure everyone here has heard the news in the last couple of years about the emerging risk. It's become a huge problem in America specifically. It's been found on every continent, including Antarctica, and it can cause mass die-offs in tons of different species. Recently, it's affected cattle, dairies, cats have a really high mortality. Pinnipeds, which is seals and sea lions, have had mass die-offs. And related to our topic, the California condor, which, as I mentioned previously, had been down to 22 birds, which were put into a captive breeding program. Considered one of the most successful restoration projects in conservation. So all of these birds are tagged and recorded, but unfortunately there was an outbreak of avian influenza, which killed 10 or so birds and set back the project almost a decade. So that just goes to show the threat of avian influenza on vultures specifically. Furthermore, There's a study by Durians et al. In Germany showing avian influenza infection in Eurasian griffon vultures, showing mortality and loss of young. And for reference, locally, there are outbreaks, mostly in poultry operations in Mozambique and South Africa. Those have been described. And the threat to vultures in Africa is generally unknown. There's very little surveillance work going on in wildlife, even in poultry operations, which is typically the source of exposure, which causes outbreaks. And yeah, there's a lot more work that needs to be done. On that note, I would like to again thank Morris Animal Foundation for their funding. This is where most of their funding goes towards, and we're really hoping to establish the presence and any sort of exposure that the vultures have had. We're doing that in a couple ways. Firstly, we're hoping to do a serologic antibody test. What that means is we take blood and we use what's called an antigen, which is a compound that's associated with that virus. And if that reacts with the blood, that means that they have antibodies to it, showing that they have been exposed to it in the past. So that gives us a little more of an idea of if this has been across the landscape. Secondly, we can directly try and identify the influenza A matrix gene. And that would show direct prevalence. So using both those methods, we can try and understand how ubiquitous avian influenza is across the landscape. We can identify strains, and we can do some work in vultures and in wildlife that is really lacking in this area.
Regarding avian influenza in vultures, so that it's especially, it's a threat for the vultures. Is it more of a threat than in corvids?
I'm not sure about corvids. I think any bird could be, if they're exposed to highly pathogenic avian influenza. There are a lot of things that could be vulnerable to that. I'm not sure about corvids.
So just no, because I guess mainly because they're, well, at least crows, because they're social, they're under a decent threat. But I've also read that they're more likely to catch it and die from it for some reason. Corvids are.
I can believe that, yeah. So this part goes beyond the research focus of my project, but really the goal of this work is to align with local on-the-ground management efforts as well. One of the collaborators we work with has a program called Eye in the Sky, which directly plugs into the movement data that we send. And if we have cluster points, which is basically aggregations of these basically pit stops that the vultures take, if they stay in the same area for too long, we can send out responders to try and identify why they're staying there. Usually you can filter out nests because they frequent them quite a bit, and that would leave us with feeding sites and potentially poisoning sites. The feeding sites could be, can also, I've seen it clue us into anthrax outbreaks, which is a prevalent disease in the area. So it can be really useful for anti-poaching to save some of the birds before even die potentially at a poisoning site. Thankfully, we haven't run across that yet. And as I mentioned, to investigate diseases. And lastly, I also want to mention some outreach that we do in partnership with Victoria Falls Wildlife Trust. They work with communities in the area to really try and educate locals on the significance of these birds, to try and demystify them with the animal ambassador that they have, which is a white-backed vulture that had a wing abnormality as a chick and was rescued. So she's a really good educator for the students and individuals who come to tour the facility. this year, or last year in 2024, we in partnership with the Falls Wildlife Trust, brought in 970 students to the facility with a big focus on education on vultures. And we hosted an event at one of the local schools with 10 different schools for International Vulture Awareness Day, where the students were educated on the importance of these birds. There were a lot of fun activities with that. There was a lot of enthusiasm for this day, which made me happy because typically vultures aren't considered the most charismatic species, but with the young kids, I was hopeful because they showed such excitement when it came to that. All right, so with that, I will. This video works. I will open it up to more questions. That was the big break that I was mentioning earlier.
What got you interested in vultures specifically?
That's a good question. So out of veterinary school in 2023, I knew I wanted to do free-ranging wildlife work. I didn't have a particular species in mind, but with my mentorship and partnership with the Big Falls Wildlife Trust, who I met through university, as well as the Warner College, who I'm very grateful for providing funding for my project. There was a mutual interest from the trust, who has been doing vulture research for quite a while, and they were hoping to expand their program. And I got approval for funding through Dean Alonso Guerre, through the Warner College. So I've been interested in vultures. I'm interested in all wildlife, and this was just a really fortunate opportunity for me. I'm very grateful. The more I looked into it and really dug into the topics, the more excited and passionate I got about my species of focus. It's really interesting. It involves land management, conservation, anthropogenic problems, and policy issues. So it really is holistically a really it aligns with my interests.
Is that bird in the bottom right-hand corner, is that a bee eater?
No, it's a lilac-breasted roller.
Ah, that's right, rollers.
How much time have you spent in Africa doing your research?
So I went to Zimbabwe last February. I wanted to get a drug certification so that I could assist with other veterinary work out there. And then I had to wait for my permits to get approved, as I mentioned, but those got approved in May. So I started my work in May and I left in November. So typically the field season in Africa for research is during the dry season, as the grasses are low, everything's visible, safer, the roads are usable. So that's my main field season. I'll be back this May and stay to November for the next 2 years.
Going back to that India case study, has there been any sort of rebound since the banning of that one specific drug? Has there been any sort of like recovery or? Yeah.
So there are studies that have tried to monitor that. As of now, the current idea is that the populations have sort of sat at that level that they decline to. There might be a slight improvement, but generally speaking, they haven't really rebounded, which just goes to show the effects of mass mortalities on these birds. These are totally novel drugs, and they've never, typically in situations in natural history where a lot of things are dying, usually they're doing pretty well. But with these drugs, usually they don't recover quickly.
Question from online. Kath Herbert asks, this question is not directly related to your specific work, but do you know the success rate for vulture rehabilitation?
That's a great question. I would defer to the group that I volunteered with in South Africa. It is the Vulture is the name of that organization. Vulture program is the longer name. So they've done quite a lot of rehabilitation and release. I think it depends on the intake symptoms. So I think if something was poisoned and it's still alive, usually they can be released. Whereas if it's a broken limb beyond a certain proximity to the body, usually those.
Could you repeat the name of that organization?
Yeah, it's called Vulpro, VULPRO.
Thank you.
And the group I work with, Big Falls Wildlife Trust, also does rehab, but certainly not at the same numbers that the South African organization does. And there is another organization that does work called Endangered Wildlife Trust in South Africa that I've collaborated with as well. They might have an idea as well.
Both like, are you thinking about or can be looking at any interactions between like subclinical lead toxicity and either those population health dynamics or like avian influenza disease?
Yeah, and on that note, some of these ideas are somewhat vague because there are so many interconnected variables from these different projects that we really have to just analyze a wide array to see what sort of covariables you can relate. That is a goal, is to try and relate all of these things, especially lead to reproductive health, etc. The challenge is, well, you could do lead toxicity prevalence in feathers related to health, but we have a much smaller sample size with the birds we capture versus the feathers. In a field day, I could collect 10, 20 primary feathers that I find in the field, whereas over the whole season, I have 10 blood samples. So you can more easily correlate the blood lead levels to the nest site, foraging area, so what proportion of their foraging sites are in trophy hunting areas or in communal landscapes. And any other questions? Oh, thanks everyone for, oh yeah, you got one more.
Yeah. Do you only study vultures in Africa, or have you studied in other continents?
So my project is focused there. So I have not done any vulture work in any other areas. I've assisted with other wildlife projects, but this is my main focus.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much. I will ask you again to please fill out the survey if you can, online or in person. And we will have another session starting at 11. That clock needs to be changed. Yeah, so please stick around for our next session, and then we have a plenary later today. So thank you all. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.